Game of Frameworks, people. I'm your host, Jay Hersko. Tonight's topic, we are going to be talking about the Scaled Agile Framework. So I have two other SAFe practitioners with me, Chris Merman.
What up?
And Andrew Leff.
Hey.
And joining us as the esteemed Scaled Agile Framework expert, we have Scott Frost with us. And Scott, thank you for joining.
I'm an extrovert only before 5 p.m.
All hail Scott Frost.
And Scott, Merman was telling me you are one of the a few SAFe fellows in the world. Is that correct?
That is true.
And what does that actually mean for our listening audience, for that may not be familiar?
Well, I'm sure I could give a snarky answer, but what I will say is as SAFe has evolved over time, there are those who have spent a lot of time implementing and those who have spent a lot of time creating the framework. And both of those groups of people really contribute to how the framework has evolved, what we're learning, how we feed everything back into the system, if you will. Okay? And so my evolution has been implementing. So I've been implementing, I tried to count it up one time, and it's definitely well over 100 release trains. It's
Good God.
Lots of large, some way too large in terms of trains and solution trains and portfolios. So I've done a lot of implementing. And over time, what I've liked about working with Scaled Agile as a group of practitioners, but also, those trying to sort of evolve this whole thing into the scale and really get beyond just IT, is that they're fairly practical, even though it seems very structured, right? And so you hear all the critique, but yet they're also trying to sort of evolve it in a way. So a couple of years ago, they decided that, hey, let's try to figure out what's beyond the contribution level of those of us who are SPCTs, right? The SAFe Program Consultant Trainers. And so they created the Fellows Program. And that was, obviously for those who are really writing and contributing to the framework, but also those who are implementing tons and then working really hard to feed that back in, to the knowledge base. And so, I think there's I want to say about 16, 18 total fellows around the globe, 12 of which work for Scaled Agile Inc. Right, and then there's 6 of us that are external in some way. I think most everyone works for a gold SPCT partner, although that's not necessarily a criteria. But I think it comes from just the years of just implementing, right? So learn by doing.
Okay.
Share it with everyone else.
So not as much academic and theory. It's more of practical application, get in the trench, roll up your sleeves, and how does this, for lack of a better term, junk really work in the real world?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, that's one of the biggest, some will say criticisms, but others will say, make it real, right? We get the class, we get the theory, but we're still talking about theory. You need to give us real examples. What does this mean to us, right? How do you translate that? So I think we all spend a lot of time doing that, right? If you're on a SAFe implementation, the class it gives them a base of knowledge, but it doesn't help them do it, if that makes sense.
Right. No, it gives you all the tools, but it doesn't tell you how to use them. You need to pick out of that tool bag and apply whatever works in the moment, right? It's not just a paste it on top and you're good to go.
Yeah, the checklists and everything, if you kind of take the, paint the analogy to like the Scrum Guide, right? It gives you everything you need, and at scale, SAFe gives you all the components, and there are checklists and there are different things, but to then actually go and do it, you have to step back as an organization and do some hard thinking. And a lot of times we find that's a real challenge. Well, I'm too busy to stop and do the hard thinking. Wait.
Right. So let me ask you.
So it takes a lot of.
Scott. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So if you had to offer up an elevator pitch, right, that describes the Scaled Agile Framework, you walk into somebody's elevator and you say, I'm a safe fellow. Okay, what's safe? What do you say? How do you do it? How do you pitch it in an elevator?
It's a great question. So if you know what your objectives are, what business objectives are you trying to achieve, right? We often, of course, now the latest phrasing, buzzwords, if you want to call it that, is business agility, right? But in the end, it's about what are you trying to achieve? And I think what SAFE or any of the other frameworks are trying to do is bring you an approach that is prescriptive enough that as a large organization, you can use it to get started, right? But once you do that, then it is all about agile mindset and principles and values in order to sustain and grow it. So it's enough to get started. And it's the approach we use to get to those business agility goals. Whatever it is I'm trying to achieve.
Perfect.
Faster this, accelerate this, right? Business value this.
Right. So let me take a bit of a side question to you, Merman and Drew, as not fellows, right? How would you approach that question differently if someone stopped the elevator and said, "What is safe?" How do you explain it? Merm, I'm going to start with you.
So my elevator pitch is going to probably be a lot different, because up until I got my SPC almost 2 years ago, I thought it was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. I really had no interest I was one of those old school Scrum dudes that thought everything scaling was stupid. And our trainer is actually a colleague of Drew's and Scott's and myself. And so when he explained it to me, I thought, this sounds even dumber than I'd read online. So what I would say is that it's a perfectly marketed framework for doing things that actually, when you get past all of the rhetoric and the myths that you hear, actually has a lot of pieces that you can use however you choose to use it. It doesn't matter how you use it, but you can use it however you need to, and you can actually accomplish some decent things with it. You just got to get over all that bullshit. Does that make sense?
No, it does. It does. Andrew?
Yeah, and I think I would approach it very similar to, if I had to echo what Scott was saying, along the lines of, hey, you may have thought this, right? We're going to go down the safe route, and we're going to look at the principles and practices that we want to build upon to build agile capabilities, and to scale those agile capabilities looks like this. And we're utilizing SAFE to be able to articulate that throughout the organization. And I think it's important that it's an approach, as well as we're going to co-create utilizing that framework. And I think we get lost within the prescriptive description as far as we need to do X, Y, and Z. As far as our approach should be this, it's not as prescriptive. We're going to utilize the framework to help the organization understand what goals it's trying to achieve, and how we can obtain them utilizing these methods, practices, and principles.
Got it. So the three of you all provided a different take on that question. I'm going to have to go back to wrap my head around it, but that's pretty insightful. Scott, I'm going to go back to you and ask you. So we're in the middle of this Game of Frameworks series where we're talking to a whole bunch of different frameworks. What are some of the attributes of SAFE that you think make it stand out in the crowd of frameworks and books and ways to approach scaling? What are some of the key attributes that you think really make it stand out, really make it shine?
So I think one thing is its continuous thirst for evolution. And there are some large enterprises that have almost given the opposite feedback, like slow down, right? Don't keep
right.
modifying and evolving the framework every year. But it really is what I would call it is it's a very adaptive model, or at least it's trying to be, right? So when DevOps came about, SAFE was pretty early on the bandwagon of, yeah, this makes total sense. We need to make sure that's visible within the framework. So we added in there. And I think now, if you look forward, I think, business agility, talent transformation, or, sort of broadening beyond the IT side and getting into the bigger enterprise side, agile HR, legal, wish everyone would start with procurement. But I think those are the things that sort of make it very extensible and accessible, versus some of the others that to me, it's like I needed to be an IT person to understand that, but I don't necessarily need it to be that in SAFe. It's a little more available, if you will, from that perspective. And there are critiques around that, right? About, it's too big, right? Or too robust, or tries to cover everything. And some of those things are fair, but it is trying to kind of wrap its arms around the whole problem of enterprise agility. And that's a big thing, right? And there's a lot to think about.
Scott, I want to press on the whole, the REBS thing, right? Because this is separate from, because I think I don't know what it was like the first few years, but we're kind of getting on a new rev every year, right? Either a .5 or a .1. We went from 4.5 to 4.6 this past year, right? So in your mind, if you were making the decision about since some companies say, how fast do you iterate on the framework, which again, for the record, only framework that does that, right? So if you had to choose, how often would you update it, right? I mean, is once a year enough? Is it not? Do we need to do more than that? Do we need to do less than that? What do you think?
It's a conversation we have all the time, I think, within the community. On one hand, we want to keep the new learnings flowing. So the early evolutions, right, in SAFe, you had farther space between the big 2.0 to 5. Or to 3.0 to 4.0. And what you did instead was you saw these extra articles being added to the site, right? Well, we added 5 more here, or 27 more articles last year, or whatever it was. But what we found was people were not necessarily finding and sort of internalizing and then leveraging that new learning. And so the more frequent revisions also became a way of sort of having a public, it's almost, to just get it out there that, hey, something is really new enough to cause, for the next rev to happen, right? And yeah, I think you can go too far and too fast, right? Because some organizations need to have some stability, in the model. But I'm hoping that it's mature enough that those organizations that have adopted it, 2 years ago, are already learning that, in the end, it's just a framework, as Dean sometimes says, right? And that you apply what you need. You don't have to take on everything new, because it used to be everybody would say, oh, we've gone from 3.0 to 4.0, or 3.5, I guess it was, to 4.0, and everyone had to stop and upgrade their SAFe. Like, value streams came out as a layer, and everybody's like, oh, shiny object, let's go create value streams, right? And I think we've kind of gotten past that, and now everybody steps back, and when there's a revision, they go, what's changed, and is there value in that new thing for us today, or are we still back here, some other earlier position, and now we've just got some extra thinking that we can do to maybe consider what's beyond DevOps. Well, we've already started there. We've got a good CI/CD pipeline going, and we've got some stuff that's working better. But do our product owners really understand, say, modern design, product, design thinking?
Yeah.
Maybe we should go focus there for a little bit. And so it is kind of good to have some just sort of continuous new kinds of stuff to think about. Because some organizations who are using SAFe, and unfortunately, they sometimes put blinders on, and they just look at SAFe.
Yeah.
And so I think there's some, also there's always some sort of feeling about, well, we have to keep feeding, right? So they'll look beyond. right? So, but it's a tough thing, right?
Yeah, it sounds to
Scaled
me.
Agile is an IP company, so they have their own sort of business model, right?
Yeah,
Right.
it sounds to me that if I'm an org that's worried that, oh no, Scaled Agile just updated the framework from 4.2 to 4.5, now you made the remark that some organizations need stability, and this may be me venting on personal experience, but it sounds to me that those are the types of organizations that panic when they see a new version come out are the types of organizations that are trying to apply it like wallpaper, just apply the entire apply all the bits and pieces of the framework to their org, and now they have to rethink. And I think my experience is those are the types of orgs that miss the forest for the trees.
And here's where I will plus one what Jay, what you just said, and what Scott said is that keeping top of mind, hey, refresh your ideas and think about how you're applying the framework, and are there pieces that you're not thinking of, right? So for example, lean portfolio management, there was an extra added emphasis in this next revision. You might not have been doing lean portfolio management previously, but because of this new emphasis on it, you may go, hey, wow, I got this new shiny new material on LPM. Maybe we should look at it. If we all remember correctly, and I like Scrum zealots don't come after me because I think all frameworks are equally good and equally bad. The most we talked about the Scrum guide was when they came out with the 5 values, right? When they updated the Scrum guide for the first time in years and they added the 5 values. That actually refreshed the conversation about the framework and what does it stand for in a way that we've not talked about in a long time. Right? I mean, y'all remember that? Like that kind of reinvigorated some of the conversation outside of the Scrum trainers kind of a thing. So Scaled Agile is just, they're coming up with ways to refresh it every year and come up with new things to talk about.
But I think it brings us back to some of the genesis behind the whole series that we're trying to put out there, right? As far as you have all these competing frameworks, but are we doing the due diligence in the organization to even understand why they're looking to do these types of things, right? So in my experience with a select few, it's around, well, we're buying this because it's trendy or it's a buzzword or we think this is the direction we need to go, and we're not doing the inspect and adapt just as a behavior within the organization to even understand why we want to scale. So I'll pause there.
No, I think you're 100% spot on. And no offense to anyone on this call, but I know for a fact that there are organizations that I have been a part of where SAFe was chosen because the management consultants that we brought in, that's the one they were most familiar with. And that's why I'm really heralding this whole series is to there's more out there. Like Scott said, you pick as Scott said early on, sort of buried the lead real early. With all these things, you need to pick the piece that makes the most sense and use it. Don't just wallpaper it on. And I think some of the companies that blame SAFe for their, and I'm doing gratuitous air quotes, scaling problems, they pull the Phillips head screwdriver out of their tool bag. They're using it as a hammer, and they don't understand why it doesn't work well.
Yeah, and so, yes, you stole some of my thunder. I think SAFe gets a bad rap because of that. In that way, as far as, if you go back to the Deming quote, every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets.
Yep.
Thunder Stealer, you Thunder Stealer.
Now we're all stealing each other's quotes. Scott, I'm going to go back to you. So you just heard that we are talking about all these different frameworks, right? So in what instances should someone who's looking at their own enterprise, their own organization, they're looking to grow Agile, what are the gotchas where they should go, Scaled Agile Framework is definitely the one for me? I know there's never any perfect system, perfect attribute, or perfect scenario, but is there a couple of things where you could give somebody a hint to say, hey, if this is what you're experiencing, you might want to give SAFe a closer look?
Yeah, and let me answer it by first kind of dovetailing into the last conversation, because I think, part of what I think we all see is if you want to act in a more agile mindset way. You find those things that can help you as an organization make that change. And transformation of any sort is hard. And the bigger you are, the harder it is. And the more monolithic your systems are, the harder it is. And, and on and on and on. And so I think you have to, first you got to get committed to making that transformation, regardless of the approach you choose, right? Whether it's competitive advantage because we're getting behind, or we're in a really good position as a leader in our industry, and we want to sustain and even accelerate that, right? So that there's no chance that our competitors will catch up, or that we would rather be the disruptor than be disrupted. So I think first you have to kind of come to that, sort of already asking and sort of needing something. And then I think you have to look at the different approaches out there and try to find the thing that helps, that resonates, within the leadership, within let's say the teams or the agile teams that you already have, right? And work really hard to avoid the whole buzzword, right? Read a book on a plane, let's use the Spotify model, right? Let's start calling it pod agile, or, and then suddenly,
oh my God,
right? There's just no, there's no real value being delivered. Things aren't really changing or improving, right? So I think first you have to understand that about your organization. And, oftentimes we're going in and we're trying to figure out, where are they really? So first we can meet them there, and then we can find the approach that works best, right? I came up through the development ranks, and first 20 years of my career was on sort of that side of the house, right? And the thing that I always struggled with, and early on in the sort of early 90s, I was really looking for ways to have a consistent and sort of self-optimizing workflow for how things get done in IT, because it was very frustrating. And, those are the days of case tools, stuff that was never ending, right? Mounds and mounds, or in our case, binders and binders and binders for the documentation, and, before you could ever start, right? And at every, 100 pages, there was a tab and a signature page, for the business to sign off, right? Literally have to sign the pages. And so we were constantly, I wish that was just a story.
You're kidding me.
Oh, no. And so,
God, for the record, Scott is really old.
Hey, I didn't talk about IBM cards and having to spell those on. Leave me alone. But I think, though, that when you go back through that and kind of trying to figure out those things, you're looking for the. Did I lose you guys?
Nope, we're still here.
No, you're here.
Oh, somehow my headphones went off and my speaker dropped on. So it's that kind of sort of workflow optimization that, for me, and all of the in enterprises that I've worked in ever since SAFe came out, that was the piece that I focused on the most. And so SAFe was really sort of at the right time, putting all those pieces in place to extend and think about flow of value and work and how you get things done. That was a lot different than any of the other what I'll call agile conversations. A lot of good agility going on, but nothing that really fixed the systemic end-to-end issues that I was always plagued with. And so to me, that's why SAFe, resonated with me so early, and that's why it seems to, fit in a lot of organizations. So I think it's been pretty successful at sort of making that transition, from, hey, it's just a framework, to, oh, well, this could actually work here.
right?
What do you mean by agile conversation, Scott? I think that I don't want to lose on that. Like, I think that's and this isn't another way to like call you old, but like, you know, because of your experience in the industry, like I don't want to just lose on that. Like, what do you mean by that?
No, it's good. So when I used to be along to a bunch of CIO forum groups, and I won't pick on any one of them, but what I would all CIOs that I was talking with, they would say, "Oh, we've tried that agile thing, right? It doesn't work, right? We never know what the teams are doing. They only were willing to commit to 2 weeks at a time, right?" And really, it was the problem was not agile. It was not the team. They were probably trying to do really good agile. It's just that everyone above the team had no idea, right? It was all just fuzzy math, right? They just had no idea what was going on.
All right. Am I back on?
Yeah.
Yeah. We sort of heard you.
Sorry about that.
That's
so,
all right.
Fine.
So you know, they really didn't understand, and they thought it was our teams do agile, but as a leader, I don't need to really know about it, right? And so, to me, SAFE was a really good way of getting that leadership to have a conversation. Now, they're often not the first to change. We wish they were, but they're not. And so we tend to, that's kind of why SAFE became the train everyone, launch trains, right? Because if we can at least get the launching up and running and start to show how it can work differently, we're delivering first, that's good. And while we're showing, we're hoping to sort of bring the leadership along. You know, hey, come to these big events like PI planning. And, you know, every time we always hear, you know, wow, I've not seen that in our organization ever. Or there's such collaboration going on. It's like, you know, we had a group once where all the business owners were like, hey, this is the first time we've ever met. You're like, what? And it's like, yeah, you know, we've worked together for 20 years and never actually met.
It's a little bit terrifying, right?
Yeah. So I think there's some, we used to talk about habits and Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habits, and how that applied in kind of this transformational setting and in SAFE, right? Sort of establishing that essential core habits, whether you're at the Agile team or the ART, solution train, or portfolio, right? What are those key habits, keystone habits, Duhigg called it, that we need to anchor.
If we change those, then we can change everything, right?
Right.
Part of me wants to really know what's going on in Scott's headphones right now. I feel like he's having an outage.
The new expensive headphones, right?
It's always peripherals that cause problems. So I want to go to the next question because I know all three of you will have something to say about this. And I'm going to start with you again, Scott. What are some of the common misconceptions that you hear about SAFE?
So common misconceptions.
Right.
I you know, the biggest one is always that it's too prescriptive. Right. It's not flexible enough. You know, and I guess I just don't see that in the implementation. There's lots of opportunity to choose or select things beyond sort of, I think, the stuff that makes SAFE safe.
Right.
But I think that's the biggest misconception, right, is that it's too prescriptive.
Well, how about you, Andrew? What do you think are some of the places you've been? What do you think the biggest misconception you have to fight against as soon as the SAFE comes in the room?
I just think that it's the silver bullet strategy, that it's going to solve all the problems. And it's not just a SAFE thing, but having dealt with that framework from a scaling perspective, more so than not, I feel like people it's going to solve everything for us. We bought it, now we're going to overlay it on our current process. We're not going to really change how we're currently working. We're just going to call it this, and that's going to solve everything. So I think, as opposed to looking at all of these as amplifiers and megaphones as far as how dysfunctional an organization can be and how do we prioritize around that dysfunction as well as work and assemble around the work. I think that to me is one of the themes that I come up against the most.
How about you, Merman?
So I will say that just to be a little slightly different, I think it's the only the variant of it's too prescriptive is it's all or nothing, right? And all it, and all it's meant to do is just be a training exercise, right? But that's the other two variations of it's too prescriptive, right? Because if you look at they say train the leaders, train the teams and launch trains, right? It's train and launch trains. It's like they just have a train thing, right? So it seems like a grand pyramid scheme, and what they don't realize is that you don't have to implement the whole thing. In fact, the very first thing when you're getting into the framework in the SPC class is we pick the most essential piece of the framework to start with, right? In fact, if you try to launch the whole thing, you're going to fail. Scott and I have paired with a client that they said we're gonna launch trains with 800 people, and we're gonna all do it at the same time, and we're gonna do it in a few weeks, and we're gonna eat the whole elephant in one bite. This will work totally, right? Like this will absolutely not fail. And we said this is not a good idea, and they're like, too bad, we're doing it anyways. And then 6 months later, they're like, why are we struggling? Right. So yeah, it's just variations on it's either a marketing scheme or it's this giant thing that you have to do all of or you're not doing it right, and that's just not true.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is, again, you're using a screwdriver as a hammer and you don't understand why it's not working well. Some of you, all three of you, touched on all my personal opinions because, again, SAFe is the one I'm most familiar with. But I do think there's a lot of times people make, I won't insult them and say stupid. I will say there's silly decisions made due to either willful ignorance or over-optimistic planning that when it comes back to bite them in the rear end, they don't really know how to react because it was, we didn't think that was going to happen. So, caveat emptor, that sort of stuff. Scott, you're closest to, as a SAFe fellow, you're very close to the what goes on behind the scenes. What can we, as practitioners or people who are looking at the Scaled Agile Framework, what's the future hold? Can you give us any ideas about maybe some of the dialogue you're hearing or some different? I know there was just another minor update release. What's coming down the pike that we should be aware of to maybe get us excited about looking in a little bit deeper and further?
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of really cool stuff coming. Obviously, there's, a huge push for several new courses, right? And I could, agree with Chris around, sometimes it feels just like train. But there are tons of organizations out there asking Scaled Agile for more training that's specific around roles, right? So, a deep dive where architects can go off for 3 days and really think about and start the conversations of architecture change, right? What really do we need to do? So there's the new SAFe for Architects class and the portfolio, the LPM class and product management, and those things are continuously evolving, and so there's a bunch of new things coming out this year around that. But I think an interesting tell was, I don't know, maybe it was January, February. There was a new little, 3-minute SAFe, I'll call it the marketing video. And it had some tells in it for the future. Did anybody catch that video? It was very professionally done, sort of an actor talking and a white screen behind them and, no safe pictures. It was all just... Did you guys see that?
No, I missed that one.
Yeah, so did I.
Yeah, so
I memorized it and then forgot it, Scott. I don't know what happened.
Oh,
but it was interesting, so today we talk about SAFe, for the lean enterprise. It's evolved from, I'll say more IT centric to maybe less over time, kind of trying to wrap their arms around the bigger capital E of enterprise. And that small little marketing video that they published start
business agility.
Okay.
So I think that's something that we talk about a lot, just in the terms of our own implementations and engagements. And I think would not surprise me at all, if that's an important part of the next evolution.
Cool. Now I'm going to go back. I'm probably going to link to the video in the show notes because I want people to go out and do their own homework. But that's really fascinating. That there's some Easter eggs already planted. You just need to know where to look. Awesome.
I love Jay. I love that. I love that Scott just said, "Hey, people are calling up SAI and they're like, hey, we could use some more emphasis and more training on some of the roles." Scott, isn't it funny? Like, I just love if their bosses came to a class and they learned how to be like leaders. There's a class that's been out since day one, and yet we can't get them in the room for 2 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's an organizational problem, right? Where the solution is always, well, train the trenches, train the people that have to do it. Whereas the whole leadership adoption and absorption, that synthesis it's a much tougher sell. I mean, you almost got to do it by gunpoint because, we know everything. We don't need to know.
Yeah, but I think also just to build on that, and then we can certainly, go to the next topic. I think it's not necessarily how do we learn as leaders, how do we practice as leaders, and taking the tools and techniques that we have, people coming in, coaching us, teaching us, training us to enable that behavior, right? It can't just be, hey, I learned about this, I'm going to go sell it within the organization. You want to inspire them to practice and breed this culture change as far as how they want others to work by displaying how they're working different.
Yeah, Scott and I we just finished day one of a 2-day leadership workshop where we presented, there's part of the framework that actually at the end of a cadence of sprints or iterations called an increment, there's a huge retrospective and problem solving workshop where we invite all of these teams to come into a room. We say, tell us your problems, and you come up with some like, hey, if you could do this for us leaders, we could actually do, you all are wanting more work, faster, better, right? If you would do this for us, we think it would help with that. And it's wonderful to be able to say, they're like, well, how's it going? Well, how it's going is they have these things that they need you to solve. Would you like to do that? And for them to just go, wait, our people sat in a room for a day or a half a day, and you had them work on stuff, and now they want us to fix stuff. Like, this is news to us. And we're like, how is this news to you? Like, you should know this.
Yeah.
Why am I, the consultant, having to tell you this?
But I think SAFe can be a very powerful tool, right? Or create a powerful capabilities within leadership to be able to help navigate that, right? And I think it's empowering those leaders to go through the fail forward mentality is, hey, we're going to experiment with you. We're part of the team. And this is how that looks. And I think SAFe frames it up in an interesting way, more so than I've seen in other scaling frameworks. And I'm not pushing the SAFe framework from a perspective of, hey, you should go SAFe. But I think it does phrase things or position things in a way to help all levels of the organization understand how to achieve those agile capabilities.
Yep. And
Yeah,
I think
it does, right? So we'll drop the quote, right? The out of the crisis Deming quote, right? If leaders can't show up, then don't send no one, right?
Right.
If management can't be a part of the change and the transformation, then it probably isn't going to sustain over time, right?
Yeah.
Get some benefits. Maybe you'll implement some, technical excellence along the way. But if you really want to sustain it, the leaders have to understand their role and make a shift and not be afraid of the harder conversations. Like, we really need to kind of move from command and control to a different kind of leadership style, whatever that is. Right?
Yeah.
There's a big continuum, right? Servant leadership on one side and command and control at the other end. And there's some thing in the middle. And we, as leadership teams, they need to sort of face that conversation and try to figure out where they're their own worst enemy.
Yeah. What's that right kind of engagement, right? Instead of showing up for a planning event and pulling your teams out in the hallway, because you really don't ever get a chance to be face-to-face and interact. So let's come outside and talk about some stuff. How do you actually show up and be part of the solution? Can leadership show up and plan their own backlog of things? Here's how we're going to look at the strategy of the organization, the strategy of our technical implementations, strategy of our architecture. Here's what we're going to actually like. We're gonna eat, drink our own champagne. I don't know why that replaced eating our own dog food. I think that sounds cooler, but we're gonna actually do this and show you that we're invested in the right way.
Yeah, and I just thought we'll kind of sort of end on what I really think is a powerful way that SAFE sort of brings things to the table. Is it really is trying to get the entire stack to have that conversation at whatever level or whatever piece of the system you operate in, right? That we need to think about better ways, lighter ways, more optimized flow-based ways to get things done, and as large organizations to be able to make these big shifts, right? Which are going to just continue to come, right? Mm-hmm. Because the ability to disrupt has nothing to do with size anymore, right? It used to be about capital and the size of an organization to be able to outpower, others.
Right.
And that just isn't the case anymore. So if we don't figure out as large organizations how to be sort of having that agility, built into the DNA in whatever approach or framework you choose, it's going to be hard to sustain and continue to be that disruptive leader in
Yep.
whatever industry you're in.
Yep. Any framework that's used for purely delivery without anything else is going to fail. I don't care if you're using, Wally's framework of fun, right? If you just say, hey, I'm going to be over here doing my own thing, right? But you all do the changing. Well, it's going to fall on its face.
Yeah. And with Wally's framework of fun, I'm going to take us out of here. Scott, if listeners want to learn more about the Scaled Agile Framework, where should they go? What resources should they tap into to educate themselves?
Well, obviously the first place is scaledagileFramework.com, right? It really is the source and the knowledge body, right? But I think as you get practitioners around locally and meetups and others, there's more and more organizations that have been doing it now for a while. So, my biggest recommendation is always find those companies, even better probably if they're not your competitors, but find them and ask them to tell you how their journey went. What have they learned? What was hard? What was easy?
Right.
Because you get a lot more out of that, I think, sometimes than trying to distill the academics of it. Right? I love the theory, and I love to read, in depth all the knowledge. But that's what jazzes me. If you're out there just trying to deliver the next release, maybe it's easier to just talk to peers at other companies.
Right.
Say, how did you do that?
Right. Knowledge of the tribe. Knowledge of the tribe. And Scott, if people want to find you, where could they find you if they were looking for you?
On LinkedIn and Twitter, you can find me at Get Frosty.
Get Frosty!
Yeah, Chris always gives me crap about that. But hey,
not the most
got him to swear.
not the most inappropriate Twitter handle I've seen, but not even close.
You'll have no idea how hard it is to get Scott to swear, and I almost got him to swear. Like that's
it was close. Yeah.
Oh, so close.
It's a rare thing. Thanks, Chris, for trying.
So on behalf of us here at the Agile Uprising, Scott, I really want to thank you for taking your time to come on and help us get the Scaled Agile Framework in front of our listeners. And also wanted to thank you, Chris Merman and Andrew Leff, for coming on as guests. And on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank all of you listeners for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this. We hope you're enjoying the series. And as a final reminder, there will be a thread about this podcast on coalition.agileuprising.com after it airs. So please hop in, join the conversation. Let us know what you learned. Let us know what surprised you. Let us know what you're surprised that we didn't cover. We can maybe touch on that in a future episode. Until next time, this is your host, Jay Hersko from the Agile Uprising podcast, signing out.
Get frosty.